Hello and welcome once again to tonight's My Macular and Me. As ever, tonight we have a leading expert on AMD. There'll be time for your questions after his very illuminating talk. So please pop your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we can during the session. Tonight's webinar is about a group of drugs known as biosimilars. Now, it's 15 years, astonishingly, since the first treatment for wet AMD came onto the market. It was, of course, Lucentis or ranibizumab. And a few years later, we had Eylea or aflibercept also became available. And these were they're known as a blockbuster drug, Lucentis, really, because it was the really first really effective treatment for wet AMD. We know that these drugs were originally extremely expensive, and although the price has come down over the years, they do still cost the NHS hundreds of millions of pounds a year. And after 15 years, the patents on these drugs are now coming to an end, and other companies are allowed to copy the original drugs because, of course, they haven't had the outlay of the investment of the development of the drug. The medicines that they make, these new so-called biosimilar drugs, are much cheaper. So what is not to like about a biosimilar drug? We need to know all about them because they are coming to a clinic near you. And so it is great to have an expert on this subject, and a great pleasure to welcome tonight's guest. Professor Richard Gale is a consultant ophthalmologist who practices in York and North Lincolnshire. He is an internationally renowned expert in medical diseases of the retina, and he's published more than 100 papers on the topics and has a particular interest in areas such as screening, artificial intelligence, clinical trials that improve the lives of people with macular degeneration. And he also works internationally very considerably as well. So it's a huge pleasure. Welcome, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you so much for your time tonight. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you, Kathy. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this really hot topic, one of the hottest of hot topics with you. And I'm so pleased to see over 100 people who've joined the meeting. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen in a moment, and I'm going to actually bring up some slides. Now, I appreciate that not everybody may be able to see slides very well, but actually, I'll tell you, it helps me as well, guide me through what I want to talk about. So I do hope you can see those slides there. So as you quite rightly say, the topic of my talk today is the biosimilars medication to treat medical disorders. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I am just going to try and move on to my next slide. Here we are. So here are some of the discussion points that I'd like us to cover over the next sort of 20 to 25 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So Kathy, you've already introduced what a biosimilar is, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But to understand what a biosimilar is, we need to understand what a biological medication is, in fact, how it's made, and that's why the complexity of this is somewhat a little bit controversial sometimes. So why are we talking about this now? We'll cover that. And I think many of us know the challenges which are facing the macular services that we all either work in or are treated in, and we'll cover that. And then some of those strategies to help mitigate those service challenges. And then the question is, could the biological medications help or hinder some of these service strategies? So for payers, people who pay for the medication, for the efficiency of services, for factors that patients experience and safety and monitoring, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions, and I'll try and do that in the next 20 to 25 minutes. Okay, so let's crack on, shall we? So what is a biosimilar? Let's break it into two different halves of the word bio and similar. So biosimilar is a medicinal product that is similar, not exactly the same, but is similar to a biological medication that has already been produced and authorized. So you get the great example of Lucentis medication, which was authorized after lots of clinical trials 15 or so years ago, and is a biological medicine. What do we mean by a biological medication? It's produced in cells. And it could be an antibody, or it could be a receptor that works against a certain chemical within the eye. In this case, this bad chemical called anti-VEGF, and it's similar. Okay, so the next thing is biological medications. They're not generic medications, or they're not copies. Let me explain that. So some people might take medication for their glaucoma and use medications such as latanoprost or monoprost or Xalatan. They are all very similar or the same medication. So the original one that came out was Xalatan. It's a very small molecule of latanoprost, which is the drug name, and then it got copied exactly. And there are lots of different versions, and one of them is called monoprost. So let's just explore that a little bit more. So these biological medications, they're really complex medications or complex molecules. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to talk about a really small molecule. Start off with, let's take an example of aspirin. Really small molecule, really easy to copy. And once it comes off patent, and it has been for many, many, many years, lots of copies can be made, and that's why we can get it cheaply. But the biological medication, for example, an antibody like Lucentis is a really big and complex structure. And why is that important? Well, it's important to understand, and I'm going to tell you about the manufacturing process of these biological medications, such as Lucentis. And basically, there's two halves to the production. There's something called the upstream side, and then there's something called the downstream process. So let's talk about that. So what happens when you try and make these biological medications, such as Lucentis? You actually start off with a cell line. So these are living cells, very small volume. And then in this upstream process, there is amplification, huge amplification of the volume of this antibody which is produced. So liters and liters and liters are produced. Okay, so that's the upstream process. Now the downstream process means that it has to be purified, ready to be put in the eye or to be fit for human use. And that involves lots of different processes, such as centrifugation, which is spinning, it needs purification, it needs the viruses filtering out of it, etc. And then you get your drug at the end of it. So it's actually a really complex process. And it's part of the reason why these medicines are really expensive. Okay, why is that important? Keep with me, please keep with me. So this is important to understand this complexity, because when we produce these, or when the pharmaceutical companies produce these biological medications, it's really common to have a degree of variability in the quality or the attributes of the medication. Not to say it's bad quality or good quality or poor quality or good quality. It's the characteristics of it. And so it's very normal with these different cell lines to have different variability. And they can suddenly change or drift, and they can suddenly shift in their qualities. And that's really important to know, because the regulators, the people who keep the pharmaceutical industry in control, say that it has to be regularly tested to ensure that it still does the job and it's still pure, etc. Okay, let's move on to that for the moment. Now, that's a really important process to understand. But what I want you to tell you is about how drugs are developed. These biological drugs are developed. So we'll go back to Kathy's example of this Lucentis medication that was produced for wet macular degeneration. And actually, what happens is the molecule is produced. It then goes through a number of different clinical trials. And those clinical trials will be very small to start off with, first in human, and then there'll be slightly larger trials to test the safety. And then there'll be much larger trials, these so-called phase 3 trials, to make sure it actually does what it's supposed to do. It's efficacious, or it has the effect that it's supposed to do. In the example of macular degeneration, to make sure it stops the leaking blood vessels and it maintains, or if not improves, vision. Now, that's slightly different for these so-called copies or biosimilar medications, because the assumption is that actually, if you're having a medication that's similar, that actually, why shouldn't it just work exactly the same? So what happens is that the regulator, for example, the MHRA, these organizations that regulate and license drugs, they say, actually, you only need one study in one disease and to compare it with the original medication. And if that's the same, then that's good enough for us. But however, in addition to that one study, which is often much smaller, you have to prove to us that the chemical structure is very, very similar. And they set what the targets are of how similar it needs to be. Okay, keep with me on this one, because this is quite important. So the development of these biosimilar medications is actually a little bit different from the original medication, or so-called originator. So they go through these biological studies of the structure, and then they have one study to compare it against the original medication to say it does what it's supposed to, does what it says on the tin, essentially. Okay, and because that clinical program of developing the drug is in effect a bit easier, it's not easy, but in fact, because it's easier, it means that it's cheaper, and it means that it's a bit quicker. Okay, so a couple of things to note. These biosimilar medications, although the medication can be very similar indeed, actually the device or the way it's given can be a little bit different. So, for example, it's still okay to have a biosimilar, one that's given in what's called a pre-filled syringe, comes packaged in a syringe. Another one might come in a vial that has to be drawn up with a separate syringe. That's okay, that's allowed. So, conclusion from this first bit of the talk, the production of these biosimilar medications is really complex, it's still expensive, and there's still variation within the biosimilar production. Okay, much like there's variation within the original medication. I'll just give you an anecdote there. So if you had the Lucentis medication in the United States, it won't come from exactly the same cell line or manufacturing process as from Europe. So likewise, it won't be exactly the same. It will still be similar, but similar enough to call it, for the regulator to call it sufficient in its active. Okay. Right, okay, I hope I haven't lost you there. So why are we talking about this now? Well, this ranibizumab medication is already off patent. That means it comes to the end of its license. Other big companies are able to copy it essentially and then market it. And there are a number of different ones that, believe it or not, are already here. And in fact, you've got another email today about another ranibizumab that's about to be launched in the UK. There are two main ones, but there's a third one on its way. Now, the aflibercept, or the Eylea medication, is not due to come off patent until 2025. So a little bit of time, but the same will happen. And these tables I show here essentially show that these medicines are in development through numerous different companies and numerous different timelines to get them available to the market. Okay, so the ones that are already here, there's one called Ongavia, produced by Teva, and I've just put up some bumps here about this single trial that it was used to compare against the original medication Lucentis. And lo and behold, it says it's very similar and it's safe to use. So that was good enough for that medicine to get its approval to be used alongside the original Lucentis or ranibizumab medication. And you know what? There's another one here. It's called Biovis. Been used for quite some time in the United States, and it's available and licensed in the UK. It hasn't been marketed yet, but it's due to be marketed. So that's just a second one of these Lucentis ones which are coming. Okay, right. So this is a little bit of detail about the design of the study. And what I want you just to reiterate here is these studies are actually much smaller than the original studies for the original medications such as Lucentis, but they're sufficient enough for the regulator. Now, I'm showing here and I'm describing some charts, and what those charts show is time along the bottom axis and up the vertical axis is the improvement of vision that comes with the injection. And you can see that there are two lines, or you might be able to see or describe that there are two lines which are sitting on top of each other. And that basically shows that they work almost identically. Okay. Now, the next thing is, are these medicines safe? So, do they have a similar side effect profile to the original medication? So all medicines have side effects. That's okay. We know that. That's how medicines work. But are they similar? And of course, there's a lot of attention to detail to ensure that the side effect profile of these injection medicines, the original Lucentis and the biosimilar ranibizumab, are very similar. So they look at key things. For example, does it cause any more inflammation or within the eye? Does it cause any infection within the eye, for example? And lo and behold, it shows that it's very similar indeed. Okay, but of course, we do need appropriate vigilance with any new medication that gets introduced into our surface. So we as clinicians, you as patients, all of us as engaged with the surface are really keen that appropriate vigilance with any new medication to ensure that it actually does what it says on the tin. Okay. So the other thing is, how can these medicines be introduced? And there's these two words which are quite specific in what they mean in the medical terminology or pharmacological terminology. There's something called switching medication, and there's something called substituting medication. So remember those small molecules such as aspirin or the eye drops I talked to you about. They're allowed to be substituted by the pharmacist. So if I write up in a prescription for this Xalatan eye drop, and the pharmacist says, well, we haven't got any of that, we've got this other medication called Monoprof, it's the same molecule, they're allowed to substitute without asking. But biological medications are not allowed to be substituted without the consent of the prescriber. And of course, that's a discussion of the prescriber and the patient who's having the medication. So they have to be switched with a consenting process. Okay, hold that thought for the moment. So we all know the current pressures on ophthalmology, retinal services, intravitreal services. We are the biggest and the most busiest specialty in the country. We're busier than ophthalmology, we're busier than orthopedics, we're busier than physiotherapy. We've seen more patients than even cardiology. And I like to remind that to my brother, who's a cardiologist, when he comes home and he said he's had a busy day. And I said, not as busy as we've had. So, and those trends are only going to continue. So there's predictions that in fact the amount of these injection treatments in the current trends may well double over the next 10 years or so. So of course, how are we trying to cope with this? Well, there's lots of organizations who are trying to predict the way forward. The College of Ophthalmologists, our professional regulatory body, tells us about macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy and how we might improve the efficiency of services and cope with this increase in demand. And there's lots of commentary by clinicians such as myself and groups of clinicians to try and call for action on macular degeneration to ensure that we have optimal management and optimal outcomes with best possible care. And lots and lots of papers if you want to Google them and have a look them up and have a look at them and read through them of how we cope. Now, I'm just talking a little bit about the pressures on the services. So we have pressures around space in clinic, many services, particularly around staffing. I'm sure we're all aware of the issues with shortage of staff, nursing staff, optometrists, junior doctors, etc. at the moment. The pressures on equipment and support and mentoring, and the pressures on funding. That's only going to get more challenging as time goes by. So it's really important to us to understand that. Now, probably the biggest issue at the moment is the staffing issue. So it's very difficult for us to employ new staff because there just often aren't there. Right, let's talk about why we may use biosimilar medication. Well, the use of biosimilar, the argument for it is almost purely financial. These biological medications, these complex medications, account for a huge proportion of global medical spending, about $1/3 trillion, dollars, should I say, $1/3 trillion in these medications. The biosimilars are only a very small proportion of that. What does that mean for the UK? Well, in the UK, we spend about £500 million per year on the biological drugs that get injected into the £500 million. That's a huge amount. You know what? It's worth it. It saves blindness. And I don't think anybody would suggest that it's not the right thing to do, but it is a lot of money, and payers are really aware of this. So what are the potential benefits of biosimilars? Well, if they're cheaper, that may well translate to cost savings. But also, if the market is open to lots of different biosimilar companies producing regulated medicines that have all been tried and tested and are all very similar, that competition will almost inevitably drive down the price, and therefore we have best prices available to us. So what could be the cost saving? What could we save if we switch to these biosimilar medications? Well, it's actually really tricky. And I'm going to give you some just very, very broad principles where we might be able to work this out. So the cost saving of a vial of the Lucentis medication versus, for example, the Biovis. Well, I don't know the prices exactly, but I'm going to hazard a guess here. So the NHS gets a discount price on the Lucentis, could be renegotiated. The price of the Biovis, which is unknown at the moment, typically these biosimilar medications are about a half or a third of the price. So let's do the math on that. Let's do the math on that. If the Lucentis, maybe all patients on current Lucentis switch to the new biosimilar, if all new patients are started on that, or even perhaps all patients, whichever one you take, you'll switch. What could that be if it was half the price of the total drug spend? Gosh, it could be £200 million. That's a lot of money. Huge amount of money. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that's the amount. I'm not saying for a minute that this is accurate, but if that huge switch happens, that could be a potential figure. Really? Really, it might be, but it might not be. So let's talk about what that £200 million could be saved on, or even if it's a fraction, £20 million or £2 million. So it could be reinvested into the NHS, so it could be into A&E departments, it could be, we would hope, as ophthalmologists and users of Macular back into ophthalmology. That's what I'd love it to see it. It could be back into retinal services. Let's imagine if it was brought back into macular services. However, we might be able to get more clinic space and equipment, but if we might be able to get equipment, and we might be able to get support and mentoring, a bit more funding. But if we just can't get hold of the staff, is the extra money going to make a difference? There's a bit of a question mark over it. Perhaps it will, perhaps it will. Okay, now some of the downsides. So many people who have been treated for the so-called macular retinovascular or choroidal vascular disease, either leaking within the macula, wet macular degeneration or diabetic macular edema, are being treated with aflibercept and not ranibizumab. That means aflibercept or the Eylea rather than Lucentis. And many people believe that that's the case because perhaps it lasts a little bit longer and perhaps less treatments are required per year. Not necessarily, but in some circumstances, that may be the case. So I can hear you saying, and I'm already thinking, why should we switch back from the Eylea medicine to a ranibizumab medicine where perhaps we might need more injections? Perhaps, perhaps not. Okay, and that's why we're really keen to compare these medicines and the amount of treatments that are required. So we really need to understand if we start the biosimilar medication, when we would need to switch away from it. Let's imagine you started, or I started the consent of my patients on biosimilar medication, and then I saw that the response was fantastic. Well, we might continue on that. We might continue and give the treatment less often. But if it wasn't a good response, we need to have a definition of what is not a good or suboptimal response. And believe it or not, that's quite a tricky definition to make. If you're really interested, you can Google it and you can see some of the papers we've written on it. Okay, so let's move into the newer medicines that have come. So there's a Beovu medication, which was longer acting, that had some side effects with it, so it's not used very often. There's this new one called Vabysmo or faricimab, which probably lasts a bit longer than the ranibizumab. There's these other things that may come in the future, such as these port delivery systems where there's a top-up that's put in. There may be other things that come in the future as well. So in a way, it's kind of a little bit of a backward step to hold back on the ranibizumab medication rather than looking to the future with medications which may be slightly more powerful, try a little bit better, or may be given longer. So there's a bit of a sort of a technological backward step that some people may feel. Okay, so some of the potential benefits. Well, do you know what? I can hear you saying, well, if we saved a whole lot of money, well, perhaps more people can be treated with it. One of my passions in treating people with macular disorders and macular disorder services is I'd like to see better and early detection. Let's imagine we spent some of that money that was saved on treating people a little bit earlier, or detection systems to detect people early, either through algorithms, AI, whatever, or by regular screening programs. I'd love to see that, because the sooner we catch people, the better usually the outcome. Okay, now something I wanted to mention to you about accessibility of these biosimilar medications. And I want to talk to you through the placebo effect. Many of us will be aware of that already. The placebo effect is that if you give a dummy pill or a dummy treatment to somebody, they may well get a perceived benefit from that. So, for example, let's talk about headaches. You gave paracetamol and you give a dummy treatment or placebo to different groups of people, and actually that dummy treatment appears to have a benefit because there's a thought that it's having a benefit. Well, the opposite can happen with biosimilar medications, the so-called nocebo effect. Nice name, nocebo. And that's because people may believe that because it's cheaper, it's worse. Yeah, you buy a cheaper car, it's worse. Well, not necessarily, but doing exactly the same job. So we need to really educate ourselves about this nocebo effect. And it's not just with patients, it's with healthcare professionals, doctors, etc., to understand the similarity. And that's why we need to understand all of that evidence I went through with you about the development and the testing to ensure that it indeed is similar and safe, and that it's regulated and monitored with vigilance. So otherwise, we might potentially lose the cost savings. It's really important not to attribute every side effect to a change in medication. Let me give an example. So about every 5 or 10 injections, it's a bit more sore, maybe even painful. Many of you will understand that. Now, let's imagine that an individual is taking the Lucentis 20, 30 times, one every 10, they found a bit more painful. Let's imagine if the new medication, the biosimilar, was used and the injection was just one of those 10 that was more painful. It would be easy to attribute that to the new medicine rather than injection technique. And that's an example of being aware of what side effects may be attributable to the to medicines or the procedure itself. Okay, right. So we need to understand about these, and essentially we need to educate ourselves. We need to educate healthcare professionals. We need to educate patients, and we need to be able to do that, and in a very successful way. So what does the College of Ophthalmology say about the guidance for giving medicines, giving these biosimilars medicines? Well, it basically said they can be used, they can be used, and but standards need to be set. There needs to be standards set about these service models. And also NHS England, who oversee all of the services in NHS, have written notes about operation notes about the procurement of these medications for medical retinal macular services. And there's a few key things here that they mention. They mention that clinical choice with all of these different medicines is really important. That relationship between the physician and the patient to decide between the two parties what is the most appropriate treatment for that individual. And it also talks about making the best use of NHS resources. And indeed, balancing the needs of patients and resources is really important. And that balance might be different for different resources or different geographical areas. And it also talks about this suboptimal response. If it's not a good enough response, for example, with one medication, whichever you start on, then clinicians should either consider stopping or changing to alternative treatment. Gosh, that is a lot of information. I'm going to try and draw some conclusions here. So I think a core understanding of the biosimilar medication is really essential, not just only for healthcare professionals and patients, but doctors, but for services, service managers, etc. Everybody needs to understand what these medications are, why they're similar, why they're not exactly the same. The potential for financial saving could be huge, but actually when we drill down to it, there might not be quite so big. And there may be some downsides in terms of a perceived technological backward step. However, let's imagine that money was reinvested to increase access to treat more patients with different diseases. But that negotiation needs, or repurposing the money needs to be agreed nationally, and perhaps not just go into the local car park that somebody wants to build. So there may well be rate limiting steps for developing services, and we must ask ourselves, is the finances actually going to be helping this? So if we're at capacity, even pouring money into the solution may not get those additional nurses because they might not just be out there for them. There's a few practical issues we need to talk about them: consenting, switching medication, monitoring, and safety reporting, etc. So many of us believe that there's quite an urgent unmet need to discuss these issues and educate ourselves, our fellow HCPs, and our service users. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was extremely interesting and very helpful. So if you have any questions about this, please pop them in the chat. So this is, it's quite a complicated costing to work out, isn't it, what the actual saving is going to be. If you're using a cheaper drug, but you have to use it more often, I imagine the cost of the drug is high, but the cost of the clinic staff is high as well, isn't it? Do you think, is it possible to make that 200 million figure harder? Can we harden that up at all to get a real idea of what the actual cost is?
Yes, I think it is. And I just put up a sensationalized figure there. I don't think really for 1 minute it will be that amount, because it's complex. It's complex in terms of who would be started on the medication. As you say, if there are more treatments, that requires more scans, more time within the injection service, more nursing time. So absolutely it is possible to cost it. And in fact, regulatory authorities or advisory authorities such as NICE, they have templates, standard templates for costing these. And they then balance the potential of one medicine against the other. And in fact, they do this when introducing new medicine. So, for example, Lucentis versus Eylea or Faricimab, and they do that. So they can cost it, actually. My feeling is that actually the cost saving would be pretty minimal pretty minimal. That's for the healthcare service. We haven't talked about additional visits to hospital, additional time in the car park, additional time away from relatives, taking time off work, etc., to bring relatives in, etc. So there's a societal cost for more treatment as well. Great point.
It does sort of slightly surprise me. I don't know whether it does you, perhaps it's my naivety, but slightly surprises me that given aflibercept, given what we know about the faricimab, Vabysmo, I'm not sure how you say it. Vabysmo is, that is intended to last for 3 months, isn't it? 12 weeks or even more. That the biosimilar manufacturers, you think, might have seen this coming and think, well, maybe it's not worth bothering with Lucentis as the first one. I suppose perhaps it just they started earlier before any of these new drugs were on the horizon. Could that be right?
That's exactly right, Kathy. So I think what we're seeing now with the ranibizumab is the decisions which were made many years ago versus Lucentis. The game will change a little bit more in 2 years' time when the aflibercept, the Eylea medicine, comes off patent, because that is a much more commonly used medicine in the UK and perhaps works a little bit longer. So I think what we're seeing is the ground being laid for the future, but there's always a bit of catch up. So the companies who are making medication, the originating medications, are always trying to push out the duration of the extension medicine. We all want that. We all want to relieve our capacity issues, and hence have patents for 7 years, etc. And we can then understand how they need to, in fact, try and keep that technological advantage ahead of the biosimilars. It's a little bit different from where biosimilars are used in other disease process, such as bowel, where there were very standard medications which just seems to be a like-for-like swap. So this is much more complex than it is than first meets the eye.
Yeah, first meets the eye. That's right. There's a question here. Does every drug have a patent that will run out, and therefore a biosimilar can then be introduced? Or does the time of the patent differ, or are they all roughly the same? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of these biological medications will have a license or a patent, etc. Typically, it's for a number of years, quite often 7 years or even a little bit longer. Now, the licensing and the patent is a little bit complex. So it can indeed be extended if a new indication is formed for that drug. Let me give you an example. So if an indication came for wet macular degeneration and it's then licensed for that, great. They have 7 years to use that medication before someone else can copy or another company can copy the drug. If that original company then does another trial in a different indication, for example, blocked blood vessels, macular edema, or diabetes, they can then extend the patency or the licensing, if you like, for a further duration as well. So the rules are the same, but the duration can differ depending on how that original company decides to, if you like, market its strategy or the so-called life cycle of that medication. Yeah, great question.
That's good. So there's a question here about whether you talked about the competition would drive down the price inevitably over time. The concern potentially, I think, in this question is that in order to achieve those savings, they might be using cheaper or less good, less effective components of the biosimilar to save on cost. Is that a risk? Does that happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it comes back to the testing of the medication. And we talked about the two aspects of how these medicines are tested. One is the original clinical trial. And the second, probably even more important in this circumstance, is the biological qualities of the production. Now, you might think, well, it's just a little bit cheaper kind of production, etc. And then it doesn't get regulated. However, it's very stringently regulated. And just as the original medications, such as Lucentis or Eylea, have to prove that they meet the same quality that biosimilar medication manufacturers do as well. And that standard is set by the regulator. So it's less of a concern. Now, I am going to say a little bit of a caveat. There have been some instances where the medication has been copied, if you like, in biosimilar in different parts of the world, and perhaps that regulation hasn't been as stringent as it is in US or EMA, and there have been some difficulties with the medicine. So I don't think it's a worry for us, but it has been a worry in the past, or could be a worry in the future for different healthcare systems. Great question.
So here's another one. You touched on the consent and patient choice over this. So there's a question here from somebody who's had Lucentis, Avastin, and Eylea, but only Lucentis has worked particularly well. Concern, obviously, will Lucentis still be available? Can she choose to have Lucentis, continue to have Lucentis?
Yes, that's a great question. So NHS England commissioning document and procurement document and NICE are really clear about this, that there's an entitlement to have medications, and that must be a careful discussion with doctor and patient in terms of a joint decision with regards to that. Now, we may think, as you suggested, that perhaps if all the cheap medications come along, that the Lucentis would no longer be available. In fact, it's very unlikely for that to be the case. It's more likely that these medications will come, but actually there'll be less marketing of the drug, for example, and there'll be less presence of the organization, the pharmaceutical company. But it's very unlikely that the medicines are going to disappear. That would be really very unlikely. And I've heard no talk about that occurring. So really important about getting the right medicine which works for the individual. And in some people, that it may be the Lucentis or it may be the Eylea. And it's really important to maintain on, find the one that's important, that's working well, and then maintain on that. And if there is a switch to another medication, then talk to the physician, talk to the doctor and say, it's not working as well, we need to reevaluate. And I'm sure a physician would have that conversation and would note that jointly along with you as well.
Bearing in mind your nocebo impact, so people would have to say that, well, am I putting this in my mind that it's not working as well as the original one because it's cheaper? It's a common thought, I think, isn't it? Here's another very good question. Can the biosimilars be made in drop forms? Now, this is a bit of a holy grail, isn't it, for anti-VEGF? If you could get it into a drop. But I guess the same problem faces the biosimilar as faces the original medicine, doesn't it, I suppose?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the case? There's nothing more that many of us would like than to have this in a drug form. Unfortunately, it's so similar to within fractions of percentage of the original medication, and it has to be because the regulators say it has to be so similar that it's given in exactly the same way. So it's given through injection treatment. In fact, many individuals may not even notice the difference because it's given in exactly the same way, in the same volume and the same frequency. So wouldn't it be great? But we're not there quite yet, and unfortunately with drop medication.
Lots of people working on it, though, aren't they? So lots of people, and we're funding some research into drops as well. So the eye is a very clever organ, isn't it, which has all these defense mechanisms precisely to stop foreign material getting from the front of the eye to the back of the eye. So there's a lot of biological protection to overcome, isn't there, to get a drop to the back of the eye?
That's exactly right. So the eye is an amazing organ, and we can see that from, well, let's imagine cataract surgery. So a new plastic lens or silicone lens is put in the eye. Why doesn't the immune system recognize it as a foreign body and start causing inflammation? And it doesn't. It's because the eye is very privileged with this deviation of the immune system. It works against some things, protein, it works against, and it works not against other bodies within the eye. And in fact, it's a real challenge because as the companies develop, if you like, stronger, more powerful medications, they're trying to increase the concentration of these proteins in the eye. And the eye says, hang on a minute, that's quite a lot of protein you're putting in here. I can tolerate a little bit, but perhaps if you put too much in, I'm going to create a bit of inflammation. And that's one of the challenges that I think this within this drug development. And of course, as you say, there are many stages of protection where drops, etc., protect the eye being protected, where the drops just don't get to the part it reaches, the Heineken test, it just doesn't get to the part that it needs to get to, and hence injections deliver the concentration that's required in the location that's required.
Great. So another question here about the cost of anti-VEGF treatment. And this is a very difficult question to answer, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. Do we have any idea what the average cost of a year's treatment with Lucentis or aflibercept, Eylea is? Can anybody get a figure on that? It's quite difficult to get that out of the NHS, I find.
It's very difficult because there's lots of components for those costs. So let's talk about hospital costs. Let's talk about the drug costs. Let's talk about patient direct societal costs as well. And these get modeled in NICE documents. If you really want to, you can go to NICE and you can Google them and find some of these predictions, but even the predictions aren't perfectly accurate. So, and even you can find the list price for a lot of the medication. So most people require, this is a very ballpark average, 6 or 7 injections per year. Let's imagine, very ballpark figure, if the medicine alone costs about £500, that's not accurate. That is £3,500 in the medicine alone. Let's imagine now the cost of the scan. Let's imagine now the cost of the staff on top of that. And that's a few £100s per visit as well. So it's very expensive medicine. So there's that side of it. But then there's also the patient, the user cost, the cost of parking, the cost of travel, the cost of time taken away from work or even carer, indirect costs as well. So I think the long and short of it, Kathy, and I'm not going to dodge it, it's expensive, but it's worth it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the price of the drug is actually a secret now, isn't it? I know that the people prefer the term confidential, but it's actually a secret. So we know what the original price was. When Lucentis came on, my memory is that it was about £700 per injection plus VAT, wasn't it? That was about but they had, as the cost has come down a little bit, but it's confidential. And this is to do with the global market, isn't it, for drugs and other countries benchmarking what they're paying for the drugs against what the NHS is often used, isn't it, I think, as a kind of global comparator for drugs. And so often the companies like the NHS to keep what the NHS is paying for the drugs quiet so that everybody else doesn't demand the same lower fee. Is that, have I given the game away rather than?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So I don't know what the costs are. I can make some assumptions. I don't know what the cost is, but you're quite right. It's a confidential discussion between the NHS purchaser and the company, and NICE may have that discussion about, you need your drug at this price, and then it meets the so-called standards. There's these funny standards that all drugs have to meet to meet cost effectiveness. So that's how they manage to get some of the prices. So I don't know what they are, and in fact, I don't really want to know what they are. That's something between the NHS purchaser and NICE, etc. So, but yes, it's expensive.
The reason the NHS can get a slightly better price sometimes is, of course, it's one organisation, isn't it? But well, in fact, I think Trust by their own, but it's a very powerful purchasing organisation, isn't it, the NHS? And we have this unique system. So anyway, so I'm afraid we can't tell you exactly. That's the truth. We can't tell you exactly how much it costs. Here's a question from somebody who says that they know that with epilepsy drugs, it's crucial to have the same make of medication every time. Would this be the same with eye treatments, or could patients be given different makes of medication from one eye injection to another, or even perhaps from one eye to another?
Great question. So there's debate at the moment about the introduction of these biosimilars. The common feeling is that individual patients should, if they start on one particular brand, that brand should then be consistent throughout. And the reason for it is they are similar, but they're not exactly the same. So there's discussion around how the consent process works around that. Are we consenting for the procedure? Are we consenting for ranibizumab? Or are we consenting for the biosimilar as a whole? So generally, good practice would be to stay on the same medication. Now, that has implications for the organizations and companies providing these biosimilars. They need to ensure that their discussion with local pharmacies provides a robust guarantee that the supply chain of these medicines will not be interrupted. There's a huge logistical exercise for getting all of these injections to the right clinic on time. In fact, we can often ring up 5 o'clock one evening and they will arrive the next morning, or maybe perhaps not quite that, but they will arrive very quickly indeed. And that supply chain is crucial because we can't interrupt the supply chain of these medicines. So supply chain is really important. Keeping consistency is really important. I don't like having different medicines into different eyes because I think the potential for confusion at all the parts if you like, in the journey is greater at that point. So hopefully that would not be the case in an ideal situation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to speed through a few questions. Got quite a lot. We've not got much time left. Very quickly, would you mind addressing a question about the adverse effects of Eylea? Somebody who is concerned about pulmonary embolism. This is blood clots in the lung, isn't it? And describes as a common cause of death when Eylea is given. I don't think there is any common cause of death with Eylea, but could you just address that, this particular adverse effects of anti-VEGF treatment?
Yeah, so the way that anti-VEGF medications, it works on blood vessels to stop them leaking. So there has been concern about what side effects may be. And indeed, that may well be if there are new blood vessels that we need in our body to try and repair. And so effects on blood clots in the lung is not within one of those adverse events of what's called special interest. It's not something that meets the radar of these medications. There's a little bit of caution, or quite a bit of caution, in people who perhaps have recently had a stroke or a heart attack. So theoretically, as the body remodels and produces new blood vessels, then following a stroke and a heart attack, that the injection medicine may stop those blood vessels helping remodeling. It's a theoretical risk, and the huge studies have suggested that actually it may not be a risk, and if it is a risk, it's very small indeed. So there's often discussion of should we give treatment in these adverse event scenarios such as myocardial infarction, heart attacks, or strokes, or should we withhold? And there's a debate between what may be the worst scenario or the better scenario: losing vision by withholding for 3 months of injection if it's required every month, versus this small theoretical issue with reduced recovery. So long story short, pulmonary embolism is not one of those that is on the radar as a common event by any means. As you quite rightly say, these are safe medications, and there are no common causes of death with the medications.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that reassures the person. Somebody's made a very important couple of important points have come up actually. One is that the biosimilars may have the effect of making the licensed drugs cheaper, so that they'll reduce the original cost of the original drugs more in order to compete with the biosimilars. But also, of course, a very important point that these drugs are very expensive, and although we in the UK can just about afford them, there are lots of parts of the world where they are not easily affordable. And in fact, I heard I was talking to somebody in Australia the other day where a lot of people, a third of people in Australia, drop out of wet AMD treatment because they have to pay for it in Australia. So it's a very different calculation, isn't it, in many parts of the world where the original drugs are too expensive to use.
This is a great point, and we want them as cheap and as available as possible, etc. So yes, the competition won't just be for biosimilars, but it'll also be the original medications. We want to see them as cheap and as accessible, and that money spent not necessarily on the cost of the drug itself, but the cost of provision, early treatment, and regular treatment on time. Two key things about good outcomes, two really good key things are early detection, early treatment, and then the second thing is regular treatment when it's required. So yeah, great point. Different healthcare systems have different pressures, hence the unlicensed debate around Avastin, etc. Great points.
Somebody also makes the point that, or asks a question about licensing across the UK. So these drugs will come into effect across the UK. It's not energy. It's not country specific, is it? Within the UK, it's across the UK that they'll be used. Okay, that's good. Somebody's just asked a question about Macugen. Oh, who can remember Macugen? Why does nobody talk about Macugen anymore?
Great question. Macugen, my word, that's a bit of a blast from the past. So Macugen was really the first kind of concept. What it did is it targeted this chemical called anti-VEGF. And anti-VEGF is the nuisance chemical that causes the growth of these blood vessels. But when it only targeted one particular type. It's called the type, or the isoform 165. And when the trials were used, it showed it was okay, but it wasn't great. Now, what the new medicines do, or the newer generations, the Lucentis, Eylea, is they target all of the types of the anti-VEGF, all of these bad medications, not just the 165, but across all. It's called pan-VEGF blockade, and they are much better. So really, I don't know anybody that's using Macugen. I don't even know whether it's still available, to be honest with you. So because the effect is so inferior to the medication.
Basically, it doesn't work. So that's why we don't talk about it anymore. It doesn't really work. Very, very quickly, because we're coming to the end now. You mentioned Avastin. Avastin originally developed with the eye in mind, but then subsequently developed as a cancer drug, an anti-cancer drug, and then repurposed back as an anti-VEGF treatment. So of course, it works in cancer by stopping blood vessels growing to feed the tumor, doesn't it? That's how it works in cancer. And somebody had the brilliant idea of, I wonder, we've got a problem with blood vessels growing in the back of the eye in wet AMD. Maybe we can use it for the same thing, and they did, and it worked. So the question here is, does Avastin is still not licensed, is it, or it's off label, or it's a political discussion that we haven't got time to go into that tonight. But would anybody make a biosimilar of Avastin? It's for the eye. It's cheap as chips already, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So a biosimilar for Avastin, I understand, is being considered for perhaps the cancer side, and I've heard, but I need to verify this, is it may be considered for the eye. The problem is the costings of all of this. So the theoretical cost, if you buy a huge vial of cancer treatment for many £100s, then somebody could aliquot it out or divide it into the actual cost of it, maybe £20, £30 per injection. I don't know what it's about, but it's much cheaper. The cost of making individual ones for the biosimilar may well be more. So I'm not sure there's a great logical or a great financial argument for doing that. It's a great question.
The person suggests that because Avastin is a slightly bigger molecule, so Lucentis is a fragment, isn't it, of the Avastin molecule? Yeah. Avastin lasts longer in the eye, and I think there was some evidence some years ago that was the case, but real world evidence since doesn't suggest. In fact, I think, am I right in saying that Avastin has fewer injections than Lucentis?
Yeah, yes, you're quite right. So there's debate about the size of the molecule. There's actually the counter argument now that much smaller molecules, much smaller molecules, such as Nabivio, actually penetrate into the tissues and perhaps then can target the antibodies better. So you're quite right that the Avastin medication in certain circumstances, particularly diabetic macular edema, diabetes leaking the back point of eye, does not work as long, and more treatments are required. You're absolutely right. So similar to ranibizumab, but not exactly the same.
And just finally on diabetic macular edema, there is a question about whether these biosimilars then will be used for patients with diabetic macular edema or retinal vein occlusion or some of the other myopic maculopathy and that kind of thing. Will they come in there as well as wet AMD?
Great question. Absolutely. So once it's a license, the biosimilar for one study, and I showed you a study about comparing macular degeneration, that license is then granted across all of the indications of all the diseases. So automatically the biosimilars will get diabetic macular edema approval, retinal vein occlusion, myopic macular degeneration, and all of the idiopathic or undetermined causes as well. So they all come lock, stock and barrel once the license is given. Great question.
That's it. We've overrun by a minute. I've got to stop. Richard, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sorry we haven't got to all the questions. There'll be another opportunity. In fact, later in the year, we're going to come back to biosimilars a bit later in the year. So don't give up hope. Richard, thank you so much. That's fantastic talk. Very, very interesting. Don't forget, everybody, this has been recorded. It will be on our website in a little bit, and you can watch it again, or do recommend it to other people if you think other people might be interested. All our webinars are on the website for you to have a look if you've missed any of them. If you have questions about your own condition, there were some questions about nutritional supplements, for example, please do give our Advice and Information Service a ring. They're there from 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and that number is 0300 30 30 111, 0300 30 30 111, open at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Next month, we're going to be talking about a new possible drug for, yes, dry AMD. Some questions tonight about dry AMD. These drugs, biosimilars at the moment, not relevant to dry, but next month we're going to be talking about a new drug coming down the line. What does the latest data show? When might this new drug become available in the UK? So do join me next month. In the meantime, have a great evening, everybody. Richard, thank you very much once again for joining us. And I'll see you all next month. Good night.